McGill student who earned her Bachelor of Arts from McGill University in 2019, where she completed an honors degree in art history with a minor concentration in anthropology. Hannah was awarded the 2019 W.O. King's Memorial Prize in Art History and worked for the university's visual art collection for 2 years as a curatorial intern while she completed her degree. Currently, she works for the Dean of Libraries at McGill, where she manages the special projects, grants, and outreach for ROAR, Rare Books and Special Collections, the Visual Arts Collection, the Oslo Library of History of Medicine, and University Archives. Her interest in immersive technology, art pedagogy, and public policy has led to an exploration of gamification and serious play in higher education and academic research library environments. Currently, she's a collaborator on a Shared Connections grant supporting McGill's Play On 2020 initiative.
Okay, so I'll make this full screen. Great. So hopefully those are. So perhaps some of us are aware of this project already, having seen it downtown, those of us who are from Montreal. So I'm going to talk briefly about this project and relating it to a number of contemporary and historic Montreal cultural programs, beginning with the 60s and also discussing Cité Mémoire. So spectral shadows emerge from the bricks and cobbles of Montreal through an immersive audiovisual tour created by local artists and Cirque du Soleil veterans Michel Lemieux and Victor Pilon in collaboration with playwright Michel-Marc Bouchard. So the projections are created from the rooftops of over 80 buildings and spread across Old Montreal and downtown. Cité Mémoire's 26 live reenactments display or claim to display the defining moments of Montreal's history. It is extolled by the city as a new way to engage the public in civic celebration, and the project's press release described that the trees, buildings, and cobblestone streets will be lit with a series of projections inspired by the city. While co-creator Victor Pilon subsequently explained in a CBC interview, we're talking about the people that created and dreamed Montreal. We're telling their stories, and we're telling the story of these characters that sort of emerge from the stones. The stones meaning the actual buildings themselves. So we'll get rid of the title so that we can see it a little bit better. And while viewers are immersed into the lives of dozens of the city's most famous citizens, it is significant that only 2 projections out of the total are chosen to represent the entirety of Indigenous history in Montreal. The reenactment of Chief Candiorong and Governor Calliere's Great Peace of Montreal from 1701 exemplifies the project's problematic engagement with Montreal's Indigenous history, which I have a picture of here. It's important to note that this is a still image of a moving projection. Through this limited engagement, First Nations lived experiences are relegated to the margins of Cité Mémoire's narrative and thereby potentially excluded from Montreal's historical memory. Through the project's organization and funding around a dual centennial year, the following presentation seeks to clarify the ways in which the municipal, federal, and provincial government's fiscal involvement in Cité Mémoire as major funding partners has influenced its lack of critical engagement with Indigenous history. But to contextualize this project, I will also consider historical programs that resemble the structures and intentions of Cité Mémoire. But to further nuance the complicated realities of state cultural programming, I also want to bring in some decolonial methodologies employed by contemporary Indigenous artists, and I mean contemporary to Cité Mémoire, who actively respond to these trends materially and discursively. So ultimately, I aim to reveal Cité Mémoire's celebratory settler colonial narratives, techniques of immersion, and the collective memories and memory work it performs. These initiatives work together to normalize the state's and its citizens' occupation of unceded Kanien'kehá:ka territory while mythologizing the Indigenous presence within these spaces. So, beginning with the Cité Mémoire project, these are just a couple of still images of other non-Indigenous themed or related memory scapes. From left to right, there are these visual and video installations on I think currently still on view in the Old Port. The first is at Place Jacques-Cartier, and the second is at the Palais de Justice, and both of which glorify kind of the earlier settlement of Montreal. So this was one of the largest projects undertaken for Montreal's programming for its 375th anniversary, which was in tandem with Canada's 150th bicentennial. And Cité Mémoire's budget of $18 million was allocated primarily from federal, provincial, and municipal funding sources. Funding was dispersed primarily through Quebec's Ministry of Culture and Communications, the City of Montreal, and the Government of Canada through its Heritage and Economic Development branches. So, Service Quebec's press release proudly encourages Canadians and Montrealers to travel through time to discover the rich history of the city and to renew their relationship with the past. So if we take a look at the similar goals expressed by the Building Communities through Arts and Heritage Program, the branch of Heritage Canada, their objectives are clearly stated as to build stronger citizen engagement through performing and visual arts and in the expression, celebration, and preservation of local historical heritage. So I find that the similarity of these statements points to a common goal of citizen engagement and the building of collective memory through site-specific immersion. So, citing the emerging technologies as one of the main draws to the project, Service Québec's press release further suggests that Cité Mémoire demonstrates to the entire world Canada's command of new technologies and confirms Montreal's status as a leader in multimedia on a global scale. And that was a quote from the press release. As a result, cultural and technological scholars Denise Meredith and Jeffrey Minson's argument in citizenship and cultural policy becomes particularly relevant. The scholars explain we are in the midst of a new enthusiasm for active citizenship and civic education. In the search for supplementary funds, cultural institutions are becoming increasingly market-driven, seeking new ways of attracting audiences. So taking that statement, I would argue that since to me, the only currency in public art is undivided attention, when over 11 million visitors arrived in 2016 to celebrate Montreal's 375th anniversary, cultural programmers carefully considered what kinds of exhibitions would garner the most engagement, and therefore, based on Meredith and Minson's suggestion, the most funding. So through their enlistment of spectacle-laden immersive technologies, those who dreamt up and subsequently paid for the project have enjoyed an undeniable triumph. At last count in 2017, over 500,000 visitors had interacted with Cité Mémoire's 26 digital tableau, while its accompanying smartphone app has been downloaded over 150,000 times. So since Service Québec proudly lists Montreal's command of new technologies as the reason for Cité Mémoire's great success, it is important to consider contemporary theories surrounding immersive digital art and its role in memory work and forming collective and civic identities. I draw a lot from Edward Said, a memory scholar, who states that memory and its representation touch very significantly upon questions of identity, of nationalism, of power and authority. Far from being neutral exercises in facts and basic truth, the study of history, which is of course the underpinning of memory, is a nationalist effort premised on the need to construct a desirable loyalty to an insider understanding of one's country, tradition, and faith. So essential to the selective pedagogies of Cité Mémoire, Said continues that the invention of tradition is a method for using collective memory selectively, and I feel selectively is a very key word here, by manipulating certain bits of the national past, suppressing others, and elevating still others in an entirely functional way. Thus, memory is not necessarily authentic, but is instead actually rather useful. So through the physical pilgrimage to memorial sites, as people can travel from one projection to the next, the movement of light into the viewer's space and its monumentally large scale, Cité Mémoire allows viewers to access collective memories by enlisting the body in immersive pedagogical acts. It is also essential to note how digital art and immersion have allowed artists to manipulate the body and to encourage viewers to feel like an eyewitness to these historical moments. Interactive digital art enables users to transcend the limitations of space, time, and speed, which I would argue makes Cité Mémoire and its espoused narratives all the more convincing. So directly linking and linked to these issues, Cité Mémoire's digital and memorial ingenuities rehearse the state's imagined vision of Montreal's historic reality. It then becomes important to ask how the project's technologically driven state funding, which was importantly allocated around celebratory anniversaries, has led to potentially perilous omissions from its pedagogical program. As Mei Chu urges in an article, Cité Mémoire enlists technologies of immersion to rehearse studies about nation and liberal modernity. While it is undoubtedly important to think about the complicated ways that Quebec and Canadian nationalisms diverge and overlap, it is equally urgent to consider the ways that they converge around settler occupation. So to return to the primary case study here, the tableau depicting the Great Peace of 1701 is particularly revealing of the celebratory colonial cause that Quebec and Canadian funding sources have rallied around. So this is strategically located at the city's monument for the treaty's initial signing over 400 years ago, now being the site of Pointe-à-Calière Museum, Archaeological Museum. Cultural programmers use site-specific technologies of immersion to share with viewers their understanding of the historical record. And this is furthered by Pointe-à-Calière's museum website, which states that this treaty, being the Treaty of 1701, put an end to several decades of conflict between the Iroquois, the French, and their allied indigenous peoples. For many, it marks the turning point in Franco-Amerindian relations. But useful to the objectives of this project, Carol Duncan expresses how art and politics often merge, and building on her existing work on museums as ceremonial spaces, she argues that museums are not the neutral spaces that they are often claimed to be. Instead, they often carry out very specific political and ideological tasks. So this being positioned at the locus of a civic monument and a partially state-funded museum, the Great Peace tableau inevitably lulls its viewers into a worryingly false sense of pedagogical security. So displayed in the scene of the tableau, which unfortunately we only have a still here, but Chief Concordia and Hector Calière are seen deferring to one another as they pass the wampum back and forth. Wampum, of course, being the historical codification device that recorded treaty negotiations. So while the treaty did usher in a short era of 30 to 40 years of relative pacification, the tableau omits the failures of the government to honor these treaties and the terms upon which they were negotiated. So, drawing from Indigenous scholarship, Ty Alfred explains that the rock that the activism of Canada's Native people has been built on is that we were originally recognized as sovereign nations through legal instruments in the Canadian and European legal context. Those agreements have been infringed and degraded and put aside, but they exist historically. So the struggle of Native people has not been to imagine a new relationship, to assert something that is outside the consciousness of historical experience of settler colonial society, but instead to say, we're asking you to uphold your own promises. Despite this, in Cité Mémoire, the Great Peace is positioned as the final chapter in Indigenous colonial relations, as it is the last tableau to deal with Indigenous history. So the selective memory that is put forth as a result is one of peace, finality, and truth, as it is confidently suggested that conflicts regarding sovereignty have been long since resolved. So moving on to the second part of the case studies I've drawn from at hand, I've included here some images from Expo 67, like this one from the Canadian Pavilion from the Bill Cotter collection here in Montreal. It is useful to trace earlier examples of the state's discomfort in addressing Indigenous collective memories, pedagogy, territorial sovereignty, and histories of trauma, especially since Expo 67 was similarly organized around a centennial year and features funding structures that resemble Montreal 375 and Canada 150. So here I'm drawing a lot from Expo scholar Jane Griffiths, who argues that despite the segregation of the Indians of Canada Pavilion from the Canadian Pavilion, Indigenous references were abundant. The Canadian Pavilion featured an inverted pyramid called Kitimavik, we can see here, which is the Inuktitut word for gathering place. And the Canadian Pavilion also featured a hide of masks, for example, and a restaurant named La Tundra, which offered tropes of Indigenous food. So here, I think the most important point is, like Cité Mémoire, the Canadian Pavilion included indigeneity, but imagined it only in the primitive past, with no reference to an Indigenous presence in the current or future physical and ideological landscape of the nation. So here I have pulled some images of the Indians of Canada Pavilion and the exhibition therein. It's important to consider how Indigenous peoples have resisted the erasure of their lived experiences from these types of programs, particularly during moments of civic celebration. It's important to note that exactly at this time, the construction of the St. Lawrence Seaway specifically to facilitate the fair was devastating for the people of Kahnawake and Akwesasne. The seaway's construction required a channel directly through Kahnawak's oldest residential area, made legal by an order in council passed in 1955, which expropriated over 1,200 acres of reserve land and displaced hundreds of families. But Alfred cites this St. Lawrence Seaway incursion as the most significant of government surrenders of Mohawk land in terms of both the sheer area involved and the long-term destructive impacts of the Kahnawake relationship. So in turn, those who were responsible for the Indians of Canada Pavilion developed it as a site for immersive techniques and pedagogical acts of resistance, which actively responded to the celebratory narratives being produced within the same space. Many installations were heavily critical of the residential school system in particular, and one pavilion installation stated, "The white man's school, an alien land for an Indian child." So it's important to ask what happens when the invisible is made visible, when knowledge relegated to society's margins or swept under its carpet is inserted into the public domain at these moments. So in partial answer, public reactions to the Indians of Canada Pavilion were resoundingly negative. And archival sources from the Globe and Mail show a woman claimed, for example, that the pavilion was horrible, and she stated, "I'm not going to stay here," while another informant explained that although it presents no apparent threat to life and limb, the pavilion is a painful embarrassment to the Canadian government. Many other informants also referenced the fact that the Canadian government was spending its own money. So I quote, that Ottawa footed the bill and that the pavilion used federal government funds and that the Indians were in their own little $500,000 teepee. A souvenir book further called the pavilion a place where Canadian taxpayers paid, in effect, to be educated on how badly they treated their native people. The controversy reached its pinnacle when the Minister of Indian Affairs threatened to shut down the whole program. And reflecting this back to the cultural programming and memory work of Cité Mémoire, Griffith's argument becomes all the more important as she explains that non-Indigenous people during the centennial were largely unable or unwilling to hear the lessons offered by the Indians of Canada Pavilion because of the impenetrable colonialism of the centennial moment. So building on this statement, the highly publicized reactions to Indians of Canada Pavilion may have predicted the government's reluctance to engage with Indigenous memories in Cité Mémoire. I'd like to avoid a direct cause and effect argument here, but I do suggest that the celebratory centennial programming emerges from the same social circumstances. Repetitive language concerning taxpayers and the perceived misuse of government funds during centennial celebrations negotiated a position that left little room for future critical engagement. So lastly, I'm going to bring in some contemporary Indigenous expressions that are at the same moment as Cité Mémoire itself, because while it's helpful to trace the origins of present-day cultural policies through programs like Expo 67, it is also important to consider other instances of Indigenous resistance that are contemporary with Cité Mémoire. This will help to demonstrate that Cité Mémoire actively performs political and ideological tasks that exclude indigeneity, not simply because there is a lack of opportunity to include Indigenous perspectives in cultural programs, but because moments of centennial celebration by their nature work to concretize the state control that Indigenous artists such as these often work against. So here I want to consider how Indigenous artists are asserting their enduring presence on unceded territory through techniques of media that recall the methods of Cité Mémoire, for example, by the use of walls and large scale. This includes situationism that engages with material sites and historical locations, collective memory, and the occupation of urban environments to manipulate geography and claims to ownership. For the purposes of this presentation, Montreal-based mural collective Unceded Voices responds to colonial installations like Cité Mémoire and Expo 67 through decolonial interventions across Montreal's urban space. Working as a group, the artists continuously draw on Indigenous memories, identities, and original place names to strengthen their position within this space. The artists themselves describe their mission as an attempt to initiate anti-colonial dialogue within settler-oriented Montreal, but also cite their work as an important place to strengthen relationships from within. Through their acknowledgement of the importance of walls and urban structures as spaces to reclaim Indigenous lifeways, many artists working within Unceded Voices chose to address the multi-generational traumas of the residential school system, which directly recalls the critical messaging of the Indians of Canada Pavilion 50 years earlier. To this end, the collective's 2017 convergence included an untitled work by Indigenous artist Dolly Deals, both of which we see here, in which the artist inscribed the words, "Some of us never came home from that school," onto a red, black, and white mural of children lining up before a residential school doorway and its religious caretaker. Dolly Deal's mural offers an alternate and less celebratory memorial path that critiques the residential school system, like the Indians of Canada Pavilion did, as I said, while offering up a different collective memory, one that is not located in the distant or primitive past, and one that is far from resolved. So also citing unceded territory in her wheat pastes that I've put next to it, she posts across the city, these perspectives are in direct opposition to the Great Pieces tableau and reflect Albert's calls to action for the Canadian state and its people to remember the original agreements that were negotiated in good faith. So, finally, upon addressing Cité Mémoire and asking what does a city remember as a result of cultural policy, it is just as essential to ask what does a city forget. So it is logical that during moments of celebration, cultural programmers would want to avoid material that, as one visitor stated, makes one feel horrible and not want to stay. However, as a project that will last well beyond the centennial year itself, the stakes of Cité Mémoire's pedagogical exclusions are high. As we've seen through the material repercussions that reverberated from Expo 67 and the creation of the St. Lawrence Seaway, the fallout from policy decisions surrounding cultural programs can be devastating for Indigenous communities and their relationships with the Canadian state. The Great Peace tableau, positioned at Pointe-à-Carrière on the exact shores where the St. Lawrence Seaway was unlawfully created, engages in an attempt to form a collective memory that forgets these erasures. So moving forward in cultural policy, it becomes essential to incorporate the voices of contemporary Indigenous artists into publicly funded, and I would note strategically located, installation pieces, despite the impenetrable colonialism of centennial celebrations, so that civic memory may include perspectives that challenge the state's biases, even if these perspectives make people not want to stay. Thanks. Do we want to switch? Okay.
Diane Wong is a Concordia University student who is an emerging curator and art historian based in the Salem Coast Salish territories and CUJAH, or Vancouver, and Montreal. Her practice and research are largely based on her experiences as a first-generation immigrant from Hong Kong and the intersection between community and diasporic identity. She recently curated Center A's annual graduate exhibition titled Dislocation, Disconnect, Disappearance. In this exhibition, Diane examined the loss of language, tradition, and culture in the diasporic community, and as a result, the disconnect between generations and how to bridge these gaps. Diane.
I just can't see the TV. For the sake of time.
Yeah, the PowerPoint is loading.
Huh?
PowerPoint is loading.
Huh?
Did you open it in Google Slides?
Huh?
Did you open it in Google Slides?
No, it's a PDF. I downloaded it as a PDF. Yeah. Sorry. Hi, so I will be talking about Karen Tam, Montreal-based installation artist Karen Tam's work and reclaiming Chinese diasporic identity through embracing stereotypes in her Chinese restaurants and curio shops. So the presentation will be broken down into several parts. I will first be introducing Karen Tam and her work to those who are not familiar with her work, and then I'll be talking about the history of Chinese migration to Canada, including the Chinese exclusion and head tax. Then the presentation will lead into the history of Chop Suey Restaurant, examining Sai Wu Restaurant in Vancouver and how it relates to Karen Tam's Golden Restaurant series. In the final part of the presentation, I will be talking about the history of Chinese curio shops in Canada and its relation to Karen's Terre des Chinois curio shop, while closely examining her sculpture work, Castelgon's Insect Mimic. Karen Tam is a Montreal-based installation artist who recreates stereotypical Chinese spaces such as Chinese restaurant, karaoke lounge, opium dens, and Chinese curio shops, and other sites of cultural exchanges. This deconstruction and reconstruction of different ethnic spaces explores the Orientalist perception of otherness. She is interested in the idea of China and what that can mean in North America and Europe, and how some of these ideas and images of China, its community, and its culture are propagated through popular culture and stereotypes, and how through different interaction, how they could inform and misinform other cultures, and how they can bring up their own biases and opinions. While at the same time, her work also includes a number of recognizable references to Chinese diasporic communities. Her works employ a tone of familiarity for the Western audience by recreating spaces that these viewers could visit for authentic Chinese culture, such as food and curio shops, in order to draw the viewers in and create an intimate space for learning and open discussion, while at the same time incorporating elements in which the audience can learn about the historical importance of these spaces. In this presentation, I'll be discussing how Karen's work through a satirical lens destabilizes the audience perception of Orientalist representation of Asian spaces through a strategic acceptance of essentializing identities by appropriating these constructed identities in order to challenge the validity of these stereotypical Chinese spaces and objects. To do so, I'll be exploring the hybridity of certain works included in the installation and the history of chop suey restaurant and curio shops and their significance in Chinese Canadian history. This embracing of hybrid identity in the early waves of Chinese immigrants who conditionally accepted certain aspects of the Canadian identity in order to be deemed acceptable and attempt to evade any additional hardship caused by racism. This is done through an exaggeration of the various aspects of so-called Chineseness in these spaces and the objects that occupy these spaces, which allows Chinese immigrant to step into this acceptable identity that was reinforced by biased stereotypes from dominant culture, creating subjects that were seemingly passive and weak that poses no threat into Canada. So Asians are often referred to as the model minority, a group that occupies an in-between status because of their socioeconomic success, while simultaneously still perpetually being viewed as a foreigner. This myth characterizes Asian immigrants as polite, law-abiding groups who have achieved a higher level of success than the general population through a combination of innate talent and as well as pull yourself up by your bootstrap immigrant striving. Occupying this model minority character acts as an ideal example to other immigrants and other people of color, suggesting that through hard work and embracing the Canadian identity, immigrants are able to create a better life for themselves in this new land. The strategic assimilation to dominant culture and the creation of hybrid identity allow them to take advantage of this bias and achieve some level of economic success, which can be seen in chop suey restaurant and curio shop. The two works that I'll be examining that you'll be able to see later is the Golden Mountain Restaurant Anglophone, so can't pronounce very well, installed at the May, and the Terre de Chinois Curio Shop at the Museum of Contemporary Art and the Laurentine in St. Jerome. So the Golden Mountain Restaurant is Pam's work in the Golden Mountain Restaurant series from 2002 to 2017, where she created installation of stereotypical Chinese Canadian cafe and restaurants that were popular from the 1930s to the 1980s. Similarly, in Terre de Chinois Curio Shop, Tam recreated Chinatown Curio Shop circa 1930s that were targeted towards Western tourists who wanted to purchase faux artifacts and antiques. I'm going to get a little bit into Chinese migration to Canada. So the term Gold Mountain, which is seen in Karen's work, can be translated to Gomsan, most often referred to as the west coast of North America, specifically British Columbia and California during the time of the gold rush. It acted as a symbol of hope for Chinese immigrants who came to North America to build a better life for themselves and their family. The search of wealth led to an influx of Chinese immigration from Khoisan and Guangdong during this period to the west. Starting in 1858, Chinese immigrants began to arrive in the Fraser Valley region as gold prospector, and by 1860s, the white Chinese population in British Columbia has reached close to 7,000. And between 1880 and 1885, 15,000 Chinese laborers built the BC section of the Canadian Pacific Railway. So two images that I have included, and I have kept the title that you can see at the bottom, is Chinese Man Washing Gold near North Bend from the city of Vancouver Archive, and for some reason they called it Chinese Work Gang on the CPR tracks near Summit, BC, from the Glenville Archives. The CPR helped connect Canada from coast to coast and solidify its identity as a nation. However, this is the place where we must not forget our nation's participation in the exclusion of other in Canadian history. The early waves of Chinese immigrants were controlled through economic, political, and social exclusion, such as the Chinese Head Tax and Chinese Immigration Act, enforcing on these early waves of immigrants a Western construction of Chinese culture and identity that came from a place of racism and bias. So the Chinese head tax was a fixed fee charged to each Chinese person entering Canada. The head tax was first levied after the Canadian Parliament passed the Chinese Immigration Act of 1885 and was meant to discourage Chinese people from entering Canada after the completion of the CPR. Started in 1885 at a $50 fee, the fee finally increased to its maximum of $500 in 1903 until the Chinese Immigration Act in 1923 that completely banned all Chinese immigration into Canada other than special circumstances. That was not reversed until 1947. So this is where we get into a little bit of history of the chop suey restaurants. At the time, Chinese immigrants were only allowed to work menial jobs, often in restaurants such as the one Tam recreated. The development of chop suey restaurant in small towns across Canada and U.S. created a place of gathering for Chinese communities. Since the 19th century, these restaurants have served not only as a place of cultural exchange, but also as ethnic resources for immigrant community, providing a sense of kinship, a link to China, and a location for trade, and a means of self-employment for the owners. These were the first type of restaurant in Canada to serve a hybrid of Chinese-Canadian cuisine, working often with available ingredients and adapting to the palates of their community, creating a cuisine and space of hybridity. In the study of chop suey restaurant, I closely examined the history of Sai Wu Chop Suey Restaurant in Vancouver, which you can see in this slide and the next one. Sai Wu Chop Suey House was and is currently located in 158 East Pender Street in Vancouver, Chinatown. The original Sai Wu restaurant occupied the location from 1925 to 1959. The restaurant is most known for its giant rooster neon sign that you can see on the right, taken from an archival image from the City of Vancouver archive. So this is what Sai Wu looks like now. In 2015, Sally Padman reopened a restaurant under the same name at this location, but serving an Asian fusion food. The complete redecoration of the restaurant can be seen in these images. In Karen's 2018 interview with Henry Heng Liu, she describes her desire to preserve and document these memories of chop suey restaurant before the slow disappearance as a result of the increase of Chinese migration in Canada in recent years and the subsequent introduction and acceptance of different regional food, Chinese food in Canada, and as well as the gentrification that occurs in many of the Chinatowns across Canada, rendering chop suey restaurant unpopular among the current diverse Canadian population. So now we get into Karen's restaurants. Karen Tam used material borrowed from local restaurant and restaurateurs to recreate the waiting, dining, and kitchen area of a Chinese restaurant. They're decorated with red and black lantern, ornate archway entrance, and the name of the restaurant in chopstick font, which you can see in the next slide. Yeah, so you can see those. All creating what all signs point to a seemingly real Chinese restaurant completed with plastic menus and placemat, creating a sense of kitschy yet familiar spaces for the visitor. The installation also includes various Chinese elements such as wooden dragon bronze head, lantern, bonsai trees, Chinese painting, and even Chinese background music. The visitor were given the rare opportunity to walk through a recreation of the back kitchen of a Chinese restaurant, decorated with rice bag, MSG bag, and other restaurant paraphernalia, which you can see here. To further understand the hybridity within the work, the viewers can examine the menus designed by Tam in the installation, which I cannot find an image of. Although at first glance it seems like a normal restaurant menu, but upon close inspection, the viewers can see that it actually contains information on Chinese Canadian history, specifically focusing on the history of chop suey restaurant and the popularization of North American Chinese food, such as chow mein, chop suey, and egg rolls that were discussed earlier. While on the side, it also contains explanation of racial slurs that were used to describe Chinese Canadians. Tam used the menu as a medium in which Chineseness could be reproduced and disseminated as stereotypes that actually works as a way to serve back power to the projection of dominant culture. By using the menu to educate the audience about the history of Chinese migration and development of North American Chinese food in Canada in conjunction with the explanation of racial slur, Tam was able to deconstruct the bias and stereotypes by putting forth an alternative to the dominant narrative to educate the viewers on Chinese experiences in Canada. This hybridity of Chinese Canadian cuisine and the exploration of their authenticity or inauthenticity is then further explored in plum sauce, as part of which I can find a still image of. As part of her food series, Plum Sauce shows Tam's father preparing the same North American Chinese specialties, revealing that plum sauce is actually made in Canada with pumpkin. The video then cuts to interviews with current and former Chinese restaurant owners to further the visitors' understanding of life in a restaurant. So now I go into a little bit about the history of the Chinese curio shop. Following the 1947 repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act, an influx of immigrants from Asia arrived in Canada. During this time, urban planning policies that aimed to revitalize Chinatown began to focus less on the need of community, forgetting that this was once the site of safe haven from exclusion for the occupants. Instead, they chose to focus on how Chinese culture could be repackaged and sold to North American audiences by selling objects such as little trinket, art objects, and faux Chinese artifacts. Faux Chinese artifacts that were popularized in the 17th and 18th century in Europe, such as the blue and white porcelain, were commonly sold in these Chinatown curio shops. So by appropriating both the material and decorative properties of East Asian artifacts, European artisans were able to construct a troupe through which Asian culture had been continued to be perceived by the West and inform the biased stereotype that was taken on by the Chinese Canadian immigrants. These shops were constructed to stand in signs of authentic culture to the white consumers. Like many of the other vernacular architectural sites commonly found in Chinatown, the curio shop was an appropriated concept, a place where cultural authenticity became a profitable lure. Karen recreates these curio shops by producing her own faux artifacts and antiques based on East Asian and Chinois objects in various museums and collections, using everyday materials, for example, the jade. So this is the Cafe Oriental Import Curio Shop that was in Vancouver, and this was a photo taken from 1977, and it's located in the Chinese Benevolent Association building, built in 1909, and this is the Cafe Importer store in 2011. And these are what curio shops would stereotypically look like, and these are ones that are actually still currently in Vancouver. And this is what Karen's shop looks like. This is the exterior, and then the interior, you can see the red lanterns, the various faux artifacts are created. And yeah, sorry, we're running a little low on time, so I'm just going through this quickly. That's funny, just let me know. So to examine this, to examine the curio shop's installation, To examine the curio shop installation, we can look at her sculptural work, Castogon Insect Mimic, which is a series of recreated vases that mimic cloisonne using sequin and styrofoam that are included in the curio shops. The work in a series of 7 triple gourd style vases was inspired by Amari style porcelain vases currently located in the MMFA. The imagery is based on the album of Immortal Blossom and Everlasting Spring by Italian artist Giuseppe Castogon, who created work for the imperial court of Kangxi, Yongjin, and Qilong emperors. Rather than depicting word, Tam included crawling insect mimics who take on the appearance of other insects in order to fool predator or prey, subtly hinting at the strategic acceptance of biased stereotypes of Chineseness in order to deceive the colonialists into believing that they have assimilated into mainstream Canadian society. So in conclusion, Tam argues that with the use of the color red, lantern, and images of dragon in these spaces, they have somehow self-exoticized as a way of economic survival. By creating these spaces and using the exoticizing images, Tam is able to mobilize the diaspora Chinese community by putting forth examination early immigration of Chinese to Canada, allowing us to reconnect with our heritage and portraying a narrative that are not taught in our education system. While we're creating spaces that are similar yet elusive due to the lack of first-hand documentation that we could examine in order to better understand the hardship that arise from the racism that the previous generation endured and the importance of community during this time. Through Tam's creation of hybrid spaces and objects that occupy these spaces, it disrupts the colonizers' ability to assert their power onto the onto the colonized because they have seemingly successfully assimilated into a dominant culture and even occupies the space of model minority, not only contributing to the Canadian society and economy by playing into the biased representation of Orientalism through the establishment of Chinese restaurants that adapted and catered to Western audiences in order to achieve economic success during periods of hardship.